What if one man refused to believe in failure, not once but 10,000 times? It was the winter of 1854. Snow blanketed the small town of Milan in northern Ohio. Inside a modest wooden house, a 7-year-old boy named Thomas Alva Edison stood quietly by a frosted window, his wide eyes gazing out into the cold, silent world. His expression wasn't quite sad, nor was it joyful. It held something else entirely, a gaze full of questions, unanswered and unasked. From the moment he could speak, Thomas had always been a peculiar child. He asked questions relentlessly. Why does the sun rise every morning? Why does darkness fall at night? Why can birds fly but people can't? Adults around him, worn down by work and tradition, had no patience for such curiosity. In an age when children were expected to obey and conform, Edison's mind was seen as troublesome rather than gifted. His first day at school made that painfully clear. Just weeks into his lessons, he disrupted the class to ask why the alphabet had to go in a specific order, and why people only studied what was already written in books. While other children obediently copied down notes, Thomas stood up and said he wanted to understand how the world truly worked. His teacher was not impressed. Within 3 months, Thomas was expelled. The school declared that he was difficult, slow, and unable to learn. People often say the first light in Edison's life came from his invention of the electric bulb. But the truth is, the very first light came from the eyes of his mother, Nancy Edison. When the school branded her son as mentally deficient, she didn't get angry. She got determined. She hugged Thomas and told him, "There's nothing wrong with you, Tom. You're just different, and that's not a bad thing. From that moment on, Nancy took it upon herself to teach her son at home. She didn't force him to memorize facts or follow rigid lessons. Instead, she opened the world of books to him, scientific texts, histories, and classic philosophy. Thomas devoured everything he could get his hands on, from Isaac Newton to Michael Faraday. More importantly, she never told him to stop asking questions. She listened. She encouraged. She believed in him when no one else did. Still, Thomas's childhood was far from easy. He suffered from chronic ear infections that gradually robbed him of his hearing. By the time he was a teenager, he had become nearly deaf in one ear. For a child already rejected by the education system, the loss of hearing was yet another door slamming shut. He became more isolated, withdrawn, and alone. But in that silence, Thomas discovered something extraordinary. A world within his own imagination. He transformed the basement into a small laboratory, filling it with strange chemicals, wires, batteries, and bits of scrap he collected from wherever he could. He conducted experiments, observed reactions, and carefully documented everything in a notebook, working like a real scientist by the age of 10. One day, a minor explosion from one of his tests caused panic in the house. While his father was furious, Thomas was overjoyed. "It worked!" he shouted, thrilled that the reaction had happened at all. To Edison, the world outside was too small for the universe inside his mind. And in that solitude, he learned a lesson no school could teach him. If no one else can answer your questions, you must find the answers yourself. One autumn afternoon, standing beside his mother as the sun dipped low behind the fields, Thomas spoke softly. "I want to make something that can chase the darkness away." Nancy looked at her son, smiled, and gently stroked his hair. She didn't ask why. She simply said, "Then begin, Tom." Darkness never wins against someone who dares to seek the light. No one could have known that in that small moment, in a poor corner of America, in silence and loneliness and rejection, a seed was planted, a seed of determination, of imagination, and of a dream so bold it would one day change the world. To bring light to the night, literally. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb at the age of 7. But he did something even more important. He believed he could. By the age of 12, Thomas Edison had already transformed himself from a misunderstood child into a self-taught scientist in the making. While other boys played games in the streets or worked in their father's shops, Thomas carried jars of chemicals in wooden crates, pushing them around in a handcart as if transporting treasure. And in his mind, they truly were. He had set up a small laboratory in the basement of his family's home, though it more often smelled like a burnt chemistry set than a place of study. The walls were stained with splashes of unknown liquids, the wooden floor scorched from minor fires. But to Thomas, it was a sanctuary, a space where questions turned into possibilities. His experiments were chaotic, unpredictable, and often dangerous. He didn't always know what he was doing, but he always knew why. He wanted to discover something, anything. He mixed chemicals not because he read a formula, but because he wondered what would happen if he did. Sometimes, the result was harmless fizzing. Other times, it was a loud bang and a face full of smoke. There was no supervision, no safety protocols, just raw curiosity and the thrill of exploration. One day, he managed to extract phosphorus from matches and attempted to create his own version of an ignition device. The experiment ended with a scorched table and a furious father who stormed into the basement and threw Thomas's entire chemical collection into the yard. It was one of the rare moments Edison cried, not because of the punishment, but because his little world had been destroyed. But if his basement lab was gone, his ambition wasn't. In fact, it only grew. At 13, Thomas got a job selling newspapers and snacks on the Grand Trunk Railway line between Port Huron and Detroit. It was a grueling job for a boy his age. Long hours, constant noise, and very little pay. But it gave him access to something most kids couldn't even dream of: mobility, information, and a captive audience of commuters. Always entrepreneurial, Thomas soon started publishing his own small newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, using a second-hand printing press he acquired. He printed it right there in the baggage car and sold it to passengers during the trip. It was a modest operation, but it made Edison the first person to publish a newspaper on a moving train. And it gave him his first taste of independence. With the money he earned, he bought new chemicals and rebuilt a portable lab, this time in an empty corner of the train's baggage compartment. Between sales, he'd sneak back to tinker with wires, batteries, and compounds. It was a risky setup. Flammable materials, glassware, and shaky train tracks made for a dangerous mix. And then it happened. During an experiment involving a vial of nitric acid, the bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the train floor. Fumes filled the car, and before Thomas could clean it up, the acid began to eat into the wood. A fire broke out. It wasn't massive, but it was enough for the conductor to come running. The blaze was extinguished quickly, but the damage was done. Edison was dragged out, his chemicals thrown from the train, and he was permanently banned from conducting experiments on board. To make matters worse, during the chaos, the conductor struck him hard across the ears, further damaging his already weak hearing. From that day forward, Thomas's hearing loss became profound and irreversible. Yet, once again, where most people would have been discouraged, Edison adapted. He later said that his partial deafness helped him concentrate better. In a noisy world, he had the advantage of silence. No idle chatter, no distractions, only his thoughts, his ideas, and the endless problems waiting to be solved. Around this time, Edison became fascinated by the telegraph. The rhythmic beeps of Morse code captured his attention, and he began teaching himself the system. After witnessing a telegraph operator work during one of his train stops, Edison approached him with questions. So many, in fact, that the man eventually agreed to let him observe more closely. Eventually, after months of practice and trial, Edison became a certified telegraph operator himself. He began working night shifts in different towns, tapping messages back and forth across wires that stretched for miles. It was during these long, lonely nights, often alone in telegraph offices, that he began sketching new ideas. He wasn't content just to use the telegraph. He wanted to improve it. His first invention attempt was a simple repeater, a device that could automatically retransmit incoming signals to extend their range. It was crude and not entirely reliable, but it worked. At least a little. And for the first time in his life, someone in the professional world took notice of what Thomas Edison could do. But for every small win, there were far more setbacks. Devices that didn't function, ideas rejected, prototypes that fizzled out. He had no formal training, no degree, no academic reputation, just a teenager with grease-stained hands and notebooks full of scribbles. Investors laughed at him. Clients dismissed him. Friends advised him to give up and find a real job. He never did, because deep down, Edison believed something no one else around him seemed to believe. That failure was not a sign to stop, but a signal to begin again, smarter, sharper, better. If his experiments exploded, so be it. If his hearing failed, he'd listen with his mind. If the world didn't understand him yet, then he'd keep building until it did. And so, in the dimly lit corners of empty train stations and makeshift workshops, a young Thomas Edison continued his quiet pursuit of light, one failed experiment at a time. By the time Thomas Edison entered his late teens, he was no longer the curious boy tinkering with chemicals in a basement. He was a young man navigating a rough and noisy world, with calloused hands, ink-stained fingers, and a heart full of resilience. His early forays into invention and telegraphy had given him a taste of possibility, but nothing had come easy, and nothing ever would. His hearing had deteriorated so badly that he could no longer engage in normal conversations. Crowded rooms confused him. Whispered remarks passed him by. But rather than dwell in frustration, Edison found focus in silence. He later joked that he had been spared from hearing useless small talk, and credited his partial deafness as a gift that allowed him to work without distraction. It was around this time that he began moving from town to town, finding telegraph operator jobs wherever he could. These weren't glamorous roles. They were grueling night shifts, often spent alone in dim offices, with only the tapping of the telegraph machine to keep him company. While others might have seen these jobs as tedious, Edison saw them as opportunities. Each shift was a chance to observe, to learn, and to experiment. He carried a notebook with him everywhere. In it, he jotted down stray ideas, odd mechanisms, questions that crossed his mind. Most of them were wild, half-formed, bordering on impractical. But within those messy pages lay the seeds of future breakthroughs. One night, while working in a telegraph office in Louisville, Kentucky, Edison accidentally spilled sulfuric acid onto the floor. The acid leaked through to the desk below, right onto his boss's shoes. The next day, Edison was fired, another job lost, another experiment gone wrong, another door slammed shut. But Edison didn't sulk. He packed his notebooks and moved on. Failure by now had become familiar company. He had tasted it at school, on the train, in workshops, in telegraph rooms. But each failure had taught him something. Each rejection forced him to refine his ideas. Each stumble reminded him that progress was rarely linear. It curved, twisted, and often looped back on itself. By 1868, at just 21 years old, Edison had filed his first patent for an electric vote recorder intended for use by legislative bodies. It was clever, efficient, and far ahead of its time. He thought it would be revolutionary. It wasn't. The government officials he pitched it to had no interest. The machine was too honest, too fast. It would eliminate the ability for politicians to stall votes, negotiate behind the scenes, or manipulate outcomes. In other words, it worked too well, and that made it inconvenient. The rejection stung. It was the first time Edison realized that invention alone wasn't enough. If people didn't want to change, no device could force them. He needed to build things that people truly needed, or at least things they believed they needed. From then on, he shifted his mindset. He wouldn't just invent for the sake of brilliance, he would invent for usefulness. He moved to New York City, penniless and hungry, sleeping in basements of offices where he tried to peddle his mechanical ideas. One morning, as fate would have it, the ticker tape machine in a brokerage firm broke down. Edison, ever observant, offered to fix it. In mere hours, he had the machine up and running, better than before. The firm's manager, impressed beyond words, hired Edison on the spot and gave him a salary high enough to rescue him from the edge of poverty. More importantly, the job came with time, space, and resources to pursue his inventions. With stability came a surge in creativity. Edison's mind was a floodgate now opened wide. He improved the stock ticker, created telegraph multiplexers, and worked on automating everything from voting to printing. For the first time, he wasn't just an eccentric tinkerer. He was becoming a serious inventor. But even with early success, Edison remained restless. New York wasn't enough. He wanted a place of his own, where ideas could run wild without constraint. In 1876, with money he had earned and investors he had convinced, he built his own research facility in Menlo Park, New Jersey. He called it a laboratory. Others would later call it the Invention Factory. It was the first of its kind, a place where science and innovation weren't left to chance, but pursued systematically. Teams of assistants worked under Edison's direction, sketching designs, testing materials, recording results. The atmosphere was electric, figuratively and literally. They worked long hours, often through the night. Failure was routine, frustration common. But something extraordinary was happening. Ideas were no longer just dreams. They were being forged into reality. It was here, at Menlo Park, that Edison would embark on the most challenging and defining quest of his life, the search for a practical, long-lasting electric light. But that chapter, like the light he sought, was still waiting to be switched on. By the late 1870s, America was changing at a blistering pace. Smoke rose from factory chimneys, trains cut through the countryside like metal serpents, and cities buzzed with the fever of invention. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and machines were reshaping every corner of life. It was an age of iron, coal, and steam, a time of practicality, progress, and profits. And yet, in the middle of this gritty utilitarian world stood a man who still believed in dreams. At Menlo Park, New Jersey, Thomas Edison had built more than a laboratory. He had built a sanctuary for ideas, an engine for imagination. While businessmen sought faster engines and cheaper steel, Edison and his team of assistants were chasing light itself. Not metaphorically, literally. The gas lamps of the time were inefficient, dangerous, and dirty. They flickered, hissed, and filled homes with smoke. But no one had yet invented a practical electric alternative. The electric arc lamp existed, yes, but it was too bright, too unstable, and impossible to use indoors. Edison believed he could do better. He wanted to create a bulb that was cheap, safe, and long-lasting. And not just one bulb, but a system, a way to generate and distribute electric light to homes and cities. It was, by every measure, a mad ambition. Many scientists had tried and failed. The consensus among experts was that it couldn't be done. Edison disagreed. "We will make electricity so cheap," he famously said, "that only the rich will burn candles." The work began with urgency and obsession. Menlo Park transformed into a hive of relentless activity. Day and night, the lab lights glowed as if defying the very darkness they hoped to banish. Assistants slept in corners, meals were skipped, and the air smelled constantly of sweat, oil, and ozone. They tested everything: bamboo, cotton thread, cardboard, platinum wire, anything that could serve as a filament. Dozens of materials failed, then hundreds, then thousands. People began to mock him. Newspapers called his project Edison's folly. Investors grew impatient. Even friends worried he had become lost in his own delusions. But Edison didn't waver. When asked why he continued after so many failures, he simply replied, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Each failed experiment was not a dead end to him. It was one step closer to the right solution. Each ruined filament was a lesson. Each shattered bulb, a data point. His obsession was total. There were nights when Edison would work for 36 hours straight, his eyes bloodshot, his hands blackened from soot. He didn't delegate the hardest work. He lived in it. His assistants recalled how he would often sleep on a lab bench for a few hours, only to wake up, scribble an idea in his notebook, and dive back into work without a word. In the fall of 1879, after months of failure and exhaustion, something finally changed. Using a carbonized cotton thread as filament, encased in a vacuum-sealed glass bulb, the team created a prototype that didn't fizzle or explode. It stayed lit for minutes, then hours. 45 hours, to be exact. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a flame that held its ground. Edison stared at the glowing bulb, barely blinking. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The light was warm, steady, miraculous. And then slowly the silence gave way to awe. No one shouted. No one danced. They were too tired, too overwhelmed. But they knew. They knew they had done something that would change the world. Edison didn't celebrate. He didn't take a vacation or bask in applause. Instead, he said calmly, "Now we have a lot more work to do." Because to him, the light bulb wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning. They needed better filaments, a reliable power source, wiring, switches, fixtures, entire infrastructure. And so the team kept working, refining, building. Later that year, Edison publicly demonstrated his invention at Menlo Park. Crowds gathered in disbelief as electric bulbs lit up entire rooms quietly and cleanly. For the first time, people saw what the world could look like without darkness. Journalists changed their tune. Investors returned, and the world tilted, just slightly, toward a new kind of future. But behind all the headlines and headlines, what truly endured wasn't just the technology, it was the mindset. While others had quit, Edison had persevered. While others had doubted, he had believed. In an age ruled by machines, he proved that vision was still the most powerful engine of all. What Thomas Edison built at Menlo Park was more than a light bulb. He built a new model of invention, a model fueled by persistence, experimentation, and an almost childlike refusal to accept impossible. And in doing so, the dreamer had finally lit up the night. It was the night of December 31st, 1879. The air was crisp in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and the ground was blanketed with a thin crust of frost. Crowds began to gather along the narrow roads, their breath visible in the cold night, their eyes wide with a mix of skepticism and wonder. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of disbelief. All came to see if the rumors were true, if the man who had spent years locked away in a lab, the so-called Wizard of Menlo Park, had truly done the impossible. On that night, Thomas Edison was not behind a workbench, nor hunched over his notebook. He stood outside, coat buttoned tight, watching as people, farmers, bankers, reporters, children, poured in by the hundreds. They craned their necks toward the cluster of small buildings at the center of Menlo Park, the ones that had, until then, only been whispered about in gossip and headlines. And then at precisely 5:30 p.m. a switch was flipped. For a second there was nothing, just silence and expectation. Then light, not the harsh blaze of arc lamps, not the fickle dance of gas flames, but a warm golden glow, steady, clean, and astonishing. Electric light spilled from the laboratory windows, poured out into the street, bathed the curious faces in a color they had never seen at night. People gasped, some applauded, a few wept. They were witnessing something more than a scientific breakthrough. They were watching night itself retreat. Edison had arranged the entire demonstration with the precision of a showman and the integrity of a scientist. A row of street lamps lit by electric bulbs guided visitors from the train station to the lab. Wires were hidden beneath walkways. Power was distributed evenly, and every bulb burned as promised. It was not just invention, it was orchestration. Reporters who had once mocked Edison now scrambled for superlatives. Headlines the next day declared that a new age had begun. Wall Street took notice. So did engineers. So did nations. But in the quiet moments after the crowd dispersed, Edison didn't boast. He didn't raise a glass or revel in glory. Instead, he walked back into the lab, took out his notebook, and began writing. There were still problems to solve. The bulb worked, but it could work better. It needed cheaper materials, more efficient wiring, a power grid. Edison was already thinking about how to bring light not just to one building, but to entire cities. His dream wasn't a single flicker in the dark. It was to banish darkness completely. Over the following months, Edison and his team filed dozens of patents. They developed generators, meters, fuses, sockets. Every piece of the electric system had to be invented from scratch. They weren't just building bulbs. They were building the entire concept of electricity as a public utility. In 1882, Edison launched the Pearl Street Station in New York City, the world's first central power plant. It delivered electricity to 59 customers in Lower Manhattan, powering homes, businesses, and streetlights. It was messy, expensive, and full of bugs. But it worked, and then it grew. Soon, cities across America, and eventually the world, began adapting electric grids. Nighttime was no longer a barrier. The human day no longer ended at sunset. Productivity soared. Factories ran late. Streets became safer. Reading at night became a luxury no longer limited to the wealthy. But for Edison, the invention was never about glory. He didn't set out to change the world. He simply wanted to solve a problem, thoroughly, completely, and without quitting. It just so happened that the problem he chose was one shared by all of humanity: darkness. Years later, when asked what it felt like to invent the light bulb, Edison chuckled. "I didn't invent it in the way people think," he said. "I just kept trying and trying and trying until it stayed lit." To most people, a light bulb is a mundane object. But to Edison, it represented something far greater. The triumph of persistence over failure, of clarity over confusion, of light over darkness. And perhaps that's why the first true electric light didn't simply illuminate a room. It illuminated the world's faith in the human spirit. Because in the end, that's what Thomas Edison really invented. Not just the light bulb, but a new way of believing in possibility. For most people, the invention of the light bulb would have been enough. Enough to rest. Enough to claim victory. Enough to carve out a permanent place in history. But for Thomas Alva Edison, it was merely a beginning. After the historic demonstration of electric light, Edison could have stepped back, published a memoir, retired into wealth and acclaim. Instead, he returned to his lab and got back to work. Invention, to him, was not an event. It was a way of life. At Menlo Park, the pace never slowed. If anything, it intensified. The laboratory that had once been focused entirely on electric lighting was now branching into dozens of other areas: communications, sound, energy, motion pictures. The very idea of a lab was evolving. Edison's model had become a template. Teams of skilled specialists working under one roof, collaborating across disciplines, applying trial and error to real-world problems. It was the world's first true industrial research and development center. Between 1880 and 1890, Edison would file over 300 patents. One of his most famous, and to him most personal, was the phonograph. It began as an accident. While working on improving telegraph and telephone technology, Edison noticed that sound vibrations could be imprinted on a surface. He wondered, could those vibrations be played back? Could the human voice be captured, saved, and heard again? He built a simple device, a rotating cylinder wrapped in tinfoil, a needle attached to a diaphragm, and a hand crank. He spoke into the mouthpiece. "Mary had a little lamb." Then he turned the crank in reverse. The words came back, faint, scratchy, otherworldly, but unmistakable. It was the first time in history that a human voice had been recorded and played back. The moment stunned him. This wasn't electricity or mechanics. This was memory. This was time, frozen and reawakened. Edison called it the talking machine, and in that moment he knew the world would never be the same. He envisioned its use for dictation, for preserving speeches, for teaching. But he couldn't yet foresee the entertainment revolution it would unleash. That would come later. Still, not all of Edison's inventions were successful or ethical. As his fame grew, so did competition. One of the most notable was a brilliant young immigrant from Serbia, Nikola Tesla. Tesla once worked for Edison, arriving in New York in the mid-1880s with dreams of revolutionizing electricity. He admired Edison, and Edison, at first, admired his intelligence. But their minds were built differently. Edison was a practical thinker, grounded in experience, reliant on iteration. He believed in slow progress, tested results, and ideas forged in the fire of failure. Tesla was a visionary, a dreamer, a theorist. He saw systems whole before they were built. He imagined alternating current, AC power, while Edison still clung to his direct current, DC model. Their professional relationship deteriorated quickly. Tesla left, and a war began, not with guns, but with volts and ideas. It became known as the War of Currents. Edison launched a campaign to discredit Tesla's AC system, arguing it was dangerous and uncontrollable. He orchestrated public demonstrations, some disturbingly cruel, to show the lethal potential of alternating current. Meanwhile, Tesla partnered with industrialist George Westinghouse and pushed forward. In the end, AC won. It was cheaper to transmit over long distances, and cities began adopting it across the country. Edison lost that battle, but he didn't stop inventing. Instead, he turned his attention to moving pictures. Working with William Kennedy, Laurie Dixon, Edison developed the kinetograph and kinetoscope, early motion picture devices that captured and displayed short films. He built the first film studio, Black Maria, in West Orange, New Jersey, where scenes were shot using natural sunlight and rudimentary sets. Though crude by today's standards, they were revolutionary at the time. People lined up to peer into the peephole of the kinetoscope and watch moving images. Dancers, boxers, comedians. For the first time, the world saw stories told through motion. Edison didn't invent cinema single-handedly, but he laid a foundation. As the 20th century approached, Edison's influence was everywhere. He had helped shape the electric grid. He had brought recorded sound into homes. He had planted seeds for motion pictures. His factories employed thousands. His patents numbered in the hundreds. But success didn't make him softer. He remained demanding, tireless, and exacting, sometimes to a fault. His marriage suffered. His children, while proud of his genius, often felt like strangers in his world. He was a man married more to his work than to anything else. And yet, even as age crept in, Edison never truly stopped. He kept notebooks beside his bed. He wandered his labs late into the night. His mind, even when his body weakened, burned with questions. Perhaps that's what made him different. Not just his intelligence, but his refusal to rest. Where others saw a finished invention, Edison saw the beginning of another problem to solve. He once said, "There's a way to do it better. Find it." And so he did, again and again. On October 18, 1931, Thomas Alva Edison took his final breath. He was 84 years old, the man who had once been called unteachable, who had been nearly deaf since boyhood, who had been laughed at, fired, doubted, dismissed, was now mourned by a nation. For 3 days, his body lay in state in his lab in West Orange, New Jersey. Thousands came to pay their respects. Engineers, factory workers, school children, presidents. They filed past his coffin in silence, not just mourning a man, but honoring a mind that had reshaped their world. Then, on the evening of October 21st, something extraordinary happened. Across the United States, for one brief moment, the electric lights went out. Cities dimmed their glow. Homes flickered into darkness. Street lamps blinked off. For 60 silent seconds, Americans stood in darkness, not to forget Edison, but to remember just how brightly he had made their world shine. And then, just as suddenly, the lights returned. It was the perfect tribute. Fitting. Poetic. A man who had spent his life chasing light had, in death, reminded the world what darkness truly meant and how far we had come from it. But Edison's legacy wasn't just technological. It wasn't about wires and filaments, patents, or prototypes. It was deeper than that. He taught the world that invention is not magic. It is labor. That genius is not lightning from the heavens. It is fire forged through persistence. That brilliance is not born, but built. Edison's notebooks, thousands of pages long, are not filled with instant breakthroughs. They are littered with crossed-out ideas, abandoned drafts, failed attempts, dead ends. He wasn't afraid to be wrong, only to stop trying. In a world that often celebrates speed and perfection, Edison stood for something far more human. The slow, stubborn, relentless pursuit of improvement. He left us more than just the light bulb, the phonograph, or motion pictures. He left us a philosophy, a blueprint for how to think, how to work, and how to believe in something even when no one else does. His words echo still. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. These are not the sayings of a lucky man. They are the creed of someone who understood that progress is slow, that creation is painful, and that success is always earned, never given. Even now, in a world lit by millions of bulbs, guided by screens, pulsing with electricity, Edison's shadow remains. His legacy lives in every startup lab, every sleepless engineer, every child who takes apart a toy just to see how it works. Because Edison didn't just light the world, he lit a path for the curious, for the stubborn, for the dreamers who dare to keep going when others quit. And that, perhaps, is the greatest invention of all.